White moves the pawn to e4, and I reply by moving the pawn to c5, entering the Sicilian defense. White pushes the pawn to e5. I develop by moving the knight to c6. White moves the knight to f3. I play a6. White plays a3. I move the pawn to e6. White develops the knight to c3. I move the knight to e7. White pushes d4. I capture on d4 with the pawn, and white recaptures with the knight. I move the knight to e5. White develops the bishop to f4. I reposition the knight to c6. White captures on c6. I recapture with the knight. White jumps the knight to e4. I push the pawn to d5. White retreats the knight to c3. I play g6. White develops the bishop to d3. I move the bishop to e7. White castles. I reposition the bishop to f8. White moves the rook to e1. I fianchetto by moving the bishop to g7. White retreats the bishop to f1. I jump the knight to d4. White moves the knight to e5. I capture it with the bishop, and white recaptures with the rook. I move the knight to c6. White plays qe2. I respond with qc7. White moves the rook to g5. I push the pawn to d4. White plays n4. I castle kingside. White checks with nf6. I move the king to g7. White retreats the knight to e4. I push the pawn to f5. White moves the knight to g3. I push the pawn to e5. White plays qf3. I develop the bishop to e6. White plays c3. I move the rook to d8. White moves the rook to d1. I move the king to h8. White pushes h4. I move the bishop to d5. White plays qe2. I retreat the bishop to e6. White plays qf3. I push e4. White captures on e4 with the knight. I recapture with the pawn. White captures on e4 with the queen. I play bf5. White plays qf3. I retreat the bishop to d7. White plays qd5. I move the queen to f4. White captures on d4 with the pawn. I capture on h4 with the queen. White plays rc1. I move the bishop to e8. White plays qc5. I capture on f2 with check. White moves the king to h1. I push the pawn to b5. White captures on f8. I recapture with the queen. White plays bd3. I check with qh6. White moves the king to g1, and white resigns.